evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, answering your questions tonight for professors of economics, the director of the Centre for Contemporary Chinese Studies, Christine Wong, Nobel Prize-winning American economist Joseph Stiglitz, who's in Australia as the guest of the Economic Society and the ANU, author and former Prime Ministerial Economics Advisor Ross Garnaut, and businesswoman, academic and columnist Judith Sloan. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Q&A is simulcast on ABC News 24 News Radio, and you can join the Twitter conversation by going to the Quanda hashtag. And remember, if you have a live question, add @Quanda to help us find it. Well, politics is usually the main topic on Q&A, but it's often just economics in disguise, as politicians debate how to manage the economy and divide our national wealth. Well, tonight on Q&A, we're cutting out the middlemen and women to question 4 distinguished economists. Our first question comes from Wong.
Thank you very much. My question is this. If I'm not mistaken, Professor Stiglitz has called the government budget, or at least some components of the budget, as a crime because it is going to hurt some of the most vulnerable in our society. While others have argued leaving the problem of debt to future generations would be morally irresponsible. So my question is, do panel members think we do have a real budgetary emergency?
Joseph Stiglitz, we'll start with you, because you are the person who said the budget was a crime.
Yeah, there is no budget emergency. You know, if Australia was facing a budget emergency, the rest of the world is in free fall. The fact of the matter is the debt-GDP ratio of Australia is 14%. It's really one of the best in the advanced countries. The real risk for the future is a lack of investment in your people. You are a rich country. You have a lot of natural resources. You're taking out those natural resources. If you don't reinvest those resources in people and education and technology, you will become a poorer country. There's so many rich natural resource countries around the world which are characterized as rich countries with poor people. And I don't think Australia wants to be one of those countries.
Now, the crime that you referred to, I think in the Sydney Morning Herald, was related to the attempts in Australia to regulate the university sector, the tertiary sector, to make it a little bit more like what's happening in the United States. Why would that be a crime?
Well, the United States has some very good universities, including Columbia. But the average performance of our education system is nothing to crow about. The fact is, on standardized scores, Americans do more poorly than the average of the OECD, which is the advanced countries. Australia does better. The basic thing, which I think some people don't understand, is that education is not like an ordinary market commodity like steel or it's an area where the price system doesn't work. There is not a single for-profit university in the United States that actually is making a real contribution to our education system. Our private universities excel in 2 areas: exploiting poor people and in lobbying. In lobbying to make sure that they don't get regulated so that they actually provide educational services, provide a real education for those who go to the schools, instead of taking advantage of those who don't really understand what they're buying. In a way, this is very much related to the area where I got the Nobel Prize, because the fundamental problem in education is those who are being educated can't know exactly what they're buying. Because if they knew what we were telling them, they wouldn't go paying us. They already would know it. By definition, they can't know what we are going to teach them before they buy it. So they have to rely on mechanisms like reputation, and those are very imperfect mechanisms. And that's why it's absolutely essential to have some kind of regulation. Now, you don't want to have over-regulation, but you have to have some kind of regulation.
Let's hear from Judith Sloan. Go on.
Well, of course, we're not getting rid of the regulation. I mean, we still will have all sorts of quality filters and the like. And the thing is that There's just such a lot of misinformation, including, I think, being peddled by you, Professor Stiglitz, about the supposed cuts in this budget. In fact, if you look at what's happened with school education, there'll be real increases of 6% every year over the forward estimates, so that's a tick, isn't it? And if we look at the allocation to the university sector, sure, there's a shift of the burden onto higher student contribution, but because it's being opened up, particularly to the sub-degree programs, see at the moment they're all closed programs, fixed budgets, we're going to allow more disadvantaged students to enter through the sub-degree programs. The actual Commonwealth expenditure on higher education also goes up. So, you know, we've got to get the characterisation of this budget accurate. It doesn't cut back on those important investment elements, but it does try and make, and I think, you know, Ross should come in here, a pretty pathetic attempt, initially at least, of trying to consolidate the fiscal position and start to lead us in the way of smaller deficits eventually to start paying off the debt. But it's a very modest start.
Ross Garnaut, you can start. In fact, you've already been invited to go by Judith Sloan, but you can start with the question that it was asked. Was there a budget emergency that required the sort of budget measures that the government has taken?
Well, we don't have a budget emergency, but we do have some big budget issues. And in the current circumstances of Australia, with commodity prices still above where they'll be in future, resource investment much higher than where they'll be in future, I'd rather have a tighter budget than we're going to end up with. There's a lot of stimulus in this budget. What's wrong with this budget is not that it's too tight, but what tightening there is, and there's actually not much, is mainly the result of reworking who pays what. An increase in the burdens on relatively low-income earners and a lightening of the burden on rents in business. And this is a much bigger feature of this budget than any overall cutbacks. The other thing this budget does is begins the process of structural reform in a number of areas that are in need of reform. And I think our university system is too rigid, Joe. But structural reform is complicated. It's hard. It means changing institutions. You've got to bring a lot of people along with them. And the way you don't do that is drop it on everyone in a budget. And especially if you're cutting the budget at the same time, that really kills the prospect of thoughtful reform. So it's not that the budget's too tight. It's who pays what through the budget and the way that it actually gets in the road of structural reform that we need.
Briefly on the question of cuts, though, are you saying they didn't go far enough in cutting the budget? Well,
if by cutting you mean increasing taxes as well as cutting expenditure, I think we needed more of it. In fact, some of the cuts in taxes move completely in the opposite direction what the government is saying. Getting rid of the carbon price hugely increases the burden that everyone else has to pay in this budget.
That's an issue we'll come... Well,
okay.
Briefly, yeah.
I just want to say, and it distorts the economy because carbon, it makes so much more sense to tax bad things than good things. Taxing pollution makes so much more sense than taxing labor or savings. So if you thought that there was a budget problem, why cut taxes on a bad thing?
We'll come back to that issue later, I promise you. Christine Wong, back to the questioner. He asked, was there a real budget emergency?
Well, I want to come back to what Joe started out with, which was about making investments for the future. I remember I was working in China for the World Bank, and Joe was my boss. And he said, go back and tell the governments that they shouldn't be cutting budgets during a crisis, financial crisis. This was the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s. And the Ministry of Finance had come in at that time to ask us, what should we do to stem the fall in growth rate? Should we be running a deficit to stimulate the economy? And we said, absolutely, yes, go do it. And they did. They after much thought, they issued 100 billion yuan in additional state debt in the form of bonds. And they used this money, actually, to begin the redistribution effort And they put the money to use in the western regions, in the poorer inland regions, to build roads and infrastructure, and began this long program, a long process whereby China has now invested in an impressive array of infrastructure that put it in very competitive position over the last 10 years and into the future. And I think that that's a good use of a budget deficit to stimulate the economy when you're facing a slowdown. And it was very important in China at that time because it was a time when capital, foreign capital, was withdrawing from other Asian countries, losing confidence in the future there. And China managed through this program to hang on and to build confidence in foreign investment, and their FDI continued to grow,
Well,
and China continued to grow.
Music to Joe Hockey's ears, because this was an infrastructure budget. That was the investment. We don't face a crisis, and I mean, we come back to this point. I think Ross and I do agree on this point, is that we have faced the biggest boom in our export prices relative to our import prices in our entire history, and not only have they been higher, they've also persisted. And yet, at the end of that, there's an issue that we're still running very significant deficits. We've racked up at a sort of gold medal rate, relatively speaking, to the rest of the world. We came from zero debt to having 14% GDP in a rapid time. And this was all in the context of basically a situation where it was manna from heaven. So I think there's a really important discussion we've had, is that have we built up a set of policies which are basically unsustainable going forward, particularly in the context now of the terms of trade likely to come down, but also an ageing society. So
okay,
you know,
well, that's another issue that we'll come back
debate.
to. Thank you, Judith. Our next question is from Terry Farrell.
Thank you for taking my question. My question is for Professor. Sorry, excuse me. What gives you the right as an American to come to Australia and criticise our budget, especially the $7 co-contribution payment, which is capped at $70 per year? The co-contribution payment is being introduced to sustain the viability of our medical system.
Well,
with respect, Professor, wouldn't it be better if you were back in your own country trying to influence them to bring in a Medicare, something similar to Medicare Australia?
Welcome to Q&A.
Well, I do comment a great deal on our Medicare system, but what I find absolutely remarkable, what I hear statements of people saying in Australia saying they want to move towards the American model. I happen to know what the American model is.
Joe, they don't say that.
I've heard people say that.
Well, Joe, it's not true. It's misrepresenting the situation.
Okay, you can come back to that, but we'd still like to hear his answer.
Okay, so the point is people should know what a private healthcare system is like, and should know how bad the American model is as they think about alternative models. There are many other models around the world. Now, the particular question goes to the role of co-payments and what is involved in that. One of the real problems in America's healthcare system is that people don't get adequate preventive care. And poor people, even a small amount of money can be a very important impediment. And remember, it's not just $7 going to the doctor once. If you go to a doctor, you have to then get a prescription. You're likely to have to go a second and third time. So we're talking about significant amounts of money for people who are very poor, who are living on the edge, who will therefore be induced not to get adequate preventive care. And the big warning that I would say that comes from America is that you have a very efficient healthcare system that is the envy of the rest of the world, that you've succeeded in providing more equal access to healthcare than most other countries. The United States is at the other extreme, where we use the market mechanism, and it's a disaster. And so there's obviously going to be important debates about whether you should have any fees or how you should design the fees. But I think that any discussion of moving towards a market model like the United States, one should be warned away from.
Okay, our questioner has her hand back up.
Yes, I just wanted to say I have personal experience with someone that's seriously ill in my family, and I'm quite happy to pay that $70 if that helps other Australians to be able to access the level of care that we do. And I don't know if you understood my question at the end. I was wondering why you aren't in Australia trying to get them to adopt a similar system as Medicare Australia.
I think he has in the United States tried to get them to adopt a different Medicare system. But we'll just hear from Judith Sloan.
But, I guess the thing is, it is hard to master the system. And we have a private system here, Joe. Primary health care in this country is private, okay? There are co-payments all over the place at the moment, right? So, there are quite a high proportion of GPs who don't charge co-payments. There are plenty that do. The system doesn't actually collapse in the context of co-payments. You have to pay a co-payment for the government subsidised pharmaceutical scheme. You almost inevitably pay a co-payment if you have to go and see a specialist doctor.
But Judith, can I remind you of your own recent article in which you said that the co-payments should not be charged to concession holders? In other words, you think they have actually made it too targeted on poorer people.
Yeah, look, I agree with Ross here. I think there were too many moving parts in this budget, and it's kind of, I think, put the progress of structural reform slightly back. I would have taken the university stuff completely out of the budget. But even with this, there are a whole lot of moving parts with the co-payment. What I would have done initially, and there are some very good socialised medical systems around the world, New Zealand, France, Sweden, they all have co-payments and they don't implode. But what I would have done had made it much simpler and imposed co-payments initially on those who don't hold concession cards. Admittedly, a large proportion of the population does, but let's see how we go.
And the reason for that is because you think that poorer people will suffer as a result?
Well, but also as a sort of experiment to see whether it is actually true that the demand for accessing primary health care does fall off dramatically. I think you'll find it doesn't. And then there could be some tweaking down the road. I think the thing is, look, I think economists are pretty boring people. They always say, because they're mainly men, that economist is someone who'd marry Elle Macpherson for her money. But look, we really are into experiments and to trial things. And so I think particularly with structural reform, particularly where there are always distributional impacts, where there are often unintended consequences, I think it's better to kind of, trial these things at the margin before you go into
briefly, because I did read your article, you also believe the government made a fundamental error in saying the money was going to go to a fund rather than back into the budget.
Well, I guess that's one of my bigger points about the budget too, is that there's too many mixed messages. I actually think people will sign up to the fact that we have to tighten our belt, we have to reduce the deficit. But when the co-payment was going into what, look, dare I say the term, some sort of big medical research slush fund, I think people kind of got a mixed message. And I think you see that also with the $22 billion that they're allocating over the 4 years to the paid parental leave scheme, So they're kind of pulling back on welfare payments in other areas, and yet they're going for the Rolls Royce of the paid parental leave scheme. So I think it's not just that I disagree with some of those measures, it's also, I think, the messaging, and Ross is an expert in this, in how you kind of sell.
Well, let's quickly
reform.
hear from Ross Garnaut. If you can make your answer brief, because we've got quite a lot of questions.
Yeah, the big thing missing from our health system is more focus on preventive investment to stop people getting really sick. And obviously the budget measures have to go back to the drawing board. They don't look like getting through the Senate. When you're looking at structural reform a second time, I think the government should be looking at how you get real investment in preventive medicine to reduce the costs in the longer-term future.
OK, let's move on to a broader question on a similar topic, but it's from Caroline Franks.
Hi, I'm really glad that you're here, Professor Stiglitz, because I'm always happy to learn from a Nobel Prize laureate, no matter what your nationality. Sorry, I've had a little blip. I'm a unemployed new graduate nurse. I'm a mother of 3, and I have a severely disabled child. And in your book, you mentioned that if we don't do something about the inequity of the Australian system, then both democracy and productivity will be deleteriously affected. I'd like to know what your solution is, if you could elaborate on that, in terms of the local Australian context and globally, and especially in relation to myself and my young adult children who are starting at university and my disabled child. Thank you.
Joseph?
Well, first let me pick up the important point that there's been a major shift in our thinking about the relationship between inequality and growth. It used to be thought that, yes, inequality is bad, but if you did anything about it, it would slow growth, increase inefficiency, distort the economy. Now the broad understanding is that, in fact, inequality is bad for economic growth, bad for economic stability. And this is not just a view that you might say the left wing. The IMF has put this at the center of their program. So, the IMF is not a left-wing organization, for those of you who don't know.
Increasingly so, though.
The broad thrust of economic research over the last 10 years is to say it's really important to try to reduce inequality, especially inequalities that arise from market distortions like monopolies, but also inequalities that arise from a failure to invest in young people, a failure to provide adequate health care for all citizens, a failure to have adequate preventive care, all these failures. Now, one of the important areas of investment are in families. Some people say, well, that's just welfare. The fact is, again, I know, talk about United States, but I know the numbers there. Okay, one out of 4 young Americans lives in a family in poverty. And that means the likelihood is that they won't get adequate nutrition, adequate health care, and that their life prospects will be diminished. It's therefore, in my mind, very important to make sure that you provide all these things for all Australian families. And these are not, these are really investments in the future. If you don't do that, you'll have greater inequality in the next generation and lower economic growth.
But Joe, we do that.
Just before, I'd just like to hear from Christine first, because she's sitting out on the edge here. Is inequality an issue for the Chinese authorities? Is that something the central command economy of a once left-wing government deals with?
Yes, actually, China is dealing with very serious issues of inequality. In 35 years of reform to install a market economy, inequality has been growing. So if you measure it with the Gini coefficient, the Gini coefficient in China is now 0.49, which is at the high end among countries in the world.
Could you explain to the audience who probably doesn't know what that is,
Yes,
the ones who don't know what that is, what that actually means?
Well, the Gini coefficient measures the proportion of people, how wealth is distributed. So when you have a perfectly equal distribution in the economy, you have a Gini coefficient of 0. If you have an economy where a single person holds all the wealth, you have a Gini coefficient of 1. And so everybody is in between 0 and 1. And I think in the OECD, the average, the rich countries, the average is around 0.3, plus or minus. And in Latin America, where you have some of the more unequal societies, you have 0.4 to 0.5. China's now at almost 0.5, 0.5. So it's reaching very high levels. And
is that because of nepotism in the party system? Because the few who make the decisions also control a lot of the capital and the means for getting capital?
Well, there's certainly that happening, but the big driver of inequality in China is the inequality between rural and urban areas. In the countryside, people are much poorer. They enjoy much lower quality public services. They have lower life expectancy. I think the last time UNDP went in to measure, I think rural average life expectancy was almost 5 years lower than in the cities. So these are the kinds of things that the government is very worried about. But China is very worried about whether it makes this climb, steadily from low-income country to middle-income country to join the rich club of countries in the world. And economists in China have been doing a lot of studies of how successful countries bridge this gap, to leave the middle income trap. Because the vast majority of countries that reach middle income never graduate to high income. And China doesn't want to be stuck with the Argentinas and Brazils of the world. They want to be, with the Japan and South Korea and other rich countries.
I tell you what, just before, thank you, Christina, just before we go to the rest of the panel, I've got another question on this subject, and we'll bring that question is Christian Stojanovsky, and Christian has a question for us. Where's Christian? Down here, sorry.
I disagree with the notion that inequality is associated with economic stagnation. I mean, since the 17 and 1800s, you've had people who were on $3 a day jump up to over $100 in a lot of Western countries, and that has come with inequality. The question I ask is, wouldn't you agree that increasing absolute wealth for everyone at the expense of a little inequality, wouldn't you think that that's better than chasing the quixotic dream of, reducing relative inequality amongst the world?
Let's hear from Judith Sloan on that first.
Well, what do we know about...
That's a trickle-down theory.
Okay, well, what do we know about inequality in Australia? We're kind of around the average, maybe slightly above. There has been a slight drift up in keeping with pretty much every developed country in the world, including Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and the like. But here's the kicker. Here's a really important point. The impact of our tax and transfer system reduces the Gini coefficient by 30%. In other words, we have a highly redistributive tax and welfare system, which is doing what you think. Of course, we don't want monopolies, we don't want rent seeking, and when those things contribute to inequality, they are very damaging to economic growth. But here's the thing, we've had 22 going on 23 years of solid economic growth. So in some ways, we should be going to America to tell you what to do, Joe, rather than the other way. And the thing is, if you look at what's happened, so the bottom quintile of the income distribution has gone up by 27% over that period. That's terrific in real terms. Okay, the top quintile's gone up by 33%. I can live with that. That's kind of seems to be happening. It actually seems to be about a higher rate of return to very specialised university qualifications, some of that stuff up at the top. That's not a bad thing. And here's another kicker. If Bill Gates came to live in Australia, I'm not sure we'd let him in through the immigration screening process, inequality would increase dramatically, but would we be a worse place? So, in fact, we've got to kind of think of those people, those wealth earners, as actually also being the ones who generate jobs. And just let me finish with another little factoid, because economists love a little factoid. If you look at the 200 wealthiest Australians that came out recently in the BRW, less than a third of those, the wealthiest 200, came from families with money, okay? So in other words, 2/3 are self-made people, so they've had a good idea, they've invested, they've worked hard, and they've struck gold. Good on it, I say.
Ross Garnaut.
Yeah. Inequality in Australia is much more moderate than in the United States because we've run things pretty well. Policy has a big effect. Judith mentioned the redistributive effects of tax and and social security, that has a big effect. We've had a good public education system. That means that kids from poor backgrounds, still lots of disadvantage, but historically they've been able to go to a reasonable school. Basic health standards have been all right for everyone. That makes us very different from the United States, very different from China, although the Chinese government wants to move in those directions. How well they'll do that, we'll have to wait and see. It would be a terrible shame if Australia went backwards on the things that have made us less unequal. And not only do you get poorer economic performance with great extremes of inequality, as Joe has mentioned, you also get poorer economic policy because you get greater tension in society. This is not such a worry for China with an authoritarian government, but it's a big issue in a democratic government. In a democracy, unless you're bringing the great majority of the people along, you're not going to get government able to do the hard things that are necessary from time to time to make the economic system work.
Joe Stiglitz, I think you do want to respond.
Yeah, make a couple points. First of all, while Australia does much better than the United States is at one extreme. One of the debates, one of the issues that really is at debate is preserving the things that you've done very well in, preserving your education and your healthcare system. And so that's one of the things that I hear a lot during my visit, that people are concerned what will be happening to those important institutions. Secondly, one of the striking things about Australia's success is it's not the best performing in the OECD. It's far from that. And given that so much of your wealth is associated with natural resources, you really should be towards the best performing. The really best performing is Norway, that took its natural resources and reinvested them in their people, including in women, and they've created the most equal and the highest income society among the advanced industrial countries. Now, you have a lot of resources. The fact that those resources really should belong to all the people, and when you tax natural resources, they don't disappear. They can't get angry in the iron ore and say, I'm going to go over to some other country because you're taxing me too much. They're underneath their ground, they're there.
Yes, they might go to another country and say, well, you do it cheaper, let's buy your products.
Well, you have to have a good auction to sell them to make sure that what we call the rent associated with those goes to the Australian people. And then that's a huge fund that you can use to bring up the people at the bottom and to create the opportunity for everybody in society.
Well, there was a chance to do something like that here. It's about to, the last remaining vestiges of the mining tax won't last very long. It's about to be voted out in the Senate.
Well, we failed. I mean, and the thing is, it's not true to say that our resources are not taxed. First of all the states, because actually it's not the whole country that owns the minerals, it's the state governments that own the minerals. There are a very substantial flow of royalty payments, and they're but
they're taxed at a lower rate than they ought to be, because these are resources that belong to the people of the state, the people of the country. You can straighten out yourself about
way oversimplified, and then of course they pay company tax on top of that. So, I mean, we had
some companies pay company tax on top of that. But there's a big hunk of Queensland coal that seems to be exported by a company that doesn't pay.
Okay, you go and look at the tax paid by Rio Tinto and BHP, Billiton, you realise what disproportionate shares of the tax revenue are coming from those two big companies. But the thing is, we tried it. It failed. We're not going back there, so we may as well move the debate on to something else.
Well, let's actually move on to another question. We've got a question that is related to the previous questions from Cassandra Giudice.
Thank you, Tony. My question to the panel is about the relationship between the price of labour and the level of unemployment. Those in favour of labour market deregulation argue that if you reduce the price of labour, you're able to employ more people and reduce unemployment, whereas those in favour of higher wage rates argue that increasing wages will increase demand and increase employment. Which is more true?
What's going on?
There is a relationship between the price of labour, if your government's regulating it, and the amount of employment. Here it's a matter of where you sit in in a range of things. In the United States, where we've got very low labour rates for unskilled labour, minimum wage is very low, then it may very well be that increases in the minimum wage don't have a significant effect on employment. In Australia, we're towards the upper end of minimum wages, so at least for unskilled people, there'd be more jobs in Australia with lower minimum wages. Lower minimum wages don't have to mean lower incomes and living standards for the people receiving them. And we got an example of that in the 80s, where at the same time as you had wage restraint for quite a long period, very strong employment growth from 83 to 89, the strongest employment growth in our history, and moderation in wages was accompanied by improvements in social security. That was when family payments were first introduced. Medicare was introduced during that period. So for the household, it's the total living standard that matters, and not only the wage that's paid in the labour market.
Joe Stiglitz.
Well, yeah, I think Ron's exactly right. It depends on the circumstances. In the United States, the evidence is overwhelming that increasing the minimum wage would be good for workers and would be good for our economy. I also want to second his point. There are a number of other instruments that one can use. One of the ones that we've used in the Clinton administration was the Earned Income Tax Credit. So what we did is we said if you worked, we would top up your salary so that we provided incentives for employers to hire workers, and at the same time we try to make sure that they were receiving a livable income.
And Judith Sloan, you can bring in industrial relations into the equation too, if you like. And we heard Bob Day, the new senator, suggesting only a couple of days ago that actually young people should be given the option as to whether they work for lower rates of pay.
I mean, it was one of the reasons I'm actually opposed to one of the budget measures, which is to refuse income support for the under 30s, the unemployed under 30s for a 6-month period, because that's way too harsh when we're putting barriers in the way of young people entering the workforce and getting the kind of hours they need to sustain themselves. So I'm with Bob Day on that, unless you try and unshackle the labour market. And in the case of Australia, it's not just a matter of the hourly rate of pay. We've also got sort of the penalty rates in particular, which is an issue. And the thing is, if you look at youth unemployment in this country, it's about 12%. Now that's bad. It's about double the overall rate, which is kind of common. But we seem to have this really peculiarly high rate of just inactivity amongst young people, and Deborah Cobb-Clark at the University of Melbourne is looking at this. So basically these are young people who are not training, they're not in education, and they're not working. And that, I think, is a real worry, because what happens to them? So I think we should have a discussion about what are the impediments to these people contracting into the labour market, because it's always better to have a job. We can't afford to be, job snobs, because once you get on the escalator of the labour market, sure, some people fall back, but many will then progress. And people might have wondered why the Audit Commission looked at minimum wages, for example, and it was for that reason that they thought you can't go off reforming the welfare system and making life very tough for people on the welfare system if at the same time you don't give them a reasonable chance of getting work.
Ross Garnaut. Yes, go.
I mean, I want to also emphasize the importance of making sure you have macroeconomic management. That one of the problems, say, in the United States is inadequate overall aggregate demand. Inadequate demand because we've had excessive austerity. And that has meant the overall economic performance is weak. Cutting wages wouldn't do any good because there are no jobs at any wage. So the real problem here, the real problem in the United States and in many other countries, is an inadequate stimulus to the economy.
Yeah. Ross Garnaut, am I right in saying that in dog days you're basically counselling that we will have to lower expectations and possibly even lower living standards in Australia?
Well, that's already happening. We're in the dog days. The resource boom reached its peak of boost to the Australian economy in September 2011. Since then, because of population growth, labour force growth, the labour force, the number of work-age people has increased by more than 4%. Aggregate monthly hours worked, the total number of hours worked by people in Australia hasn't increased at all. So that's a pretty sick labour market. It's much harder to get a job now, much harder to get the number of hours of work that you want than it was 2 years ago or 1 year ago. And in the last year, that's been reflected in something that's very unusual in Australia. We've been keeping statistics on wages like we keep them now since 1998. In the last year, for the very first time, the year up till May this year, wages rose less rapidly than inflation. Real wages fell. So that's the dog days. So it's already here. But that's the labour market working. And for those people who say that there's something terribly wrong with our industrial relations and the labour market, I think they need to reflect on that. The labour market is actually delivering wage moderation in response to what has been a pretty weak labour market.
What I want to emphasize, it's also evidence that the real underlying problem is lack of overall demand. Because it's not the wages that are restraining employment, it's the lack of demand. Because wages, as you say, are declining.
Yeah,
wages adjusted for inflation.
And continuing with my book, Dog Days, I think that the thing that's missing is an improvement in competitiveness through depreciation of the real exchange rate. Boosting demand in other ways won't do the job in today's circumstances.
And the other thing that was missing was you holding it up for the camera. Thank God you did that. You're watching Q&A live and interactive, and tonight we're asking you to help choose a question for our panel. If you're on Twitter, check the last two @Quanda tweets. Each is a potential question. Retweet the one you prefer. We'll put the most popular question to our panel. First, let's take our next question. It's from Jennifer Sue.
So my question is, to what extent has Australia's engagement and dependence on China affected the Australian government's capacity to focus and develop sectors of the economy that are not related to the extractive industries?
Christine Wong.
The question is, what?
To what extent is our dependence on China in a way distorting the way we behave in our own market?
Well, the first distortive effect is that the resource boom has pushed up wages and other prices in the economy and the real exchange rate. So the Australian dollar is very strong, which makes it very hard for our manufacturing to compete against manufacturing products from elsewhere in the world. And so you see a decline in manufacturing in Australia.
It's a strange downside of a boom, isn't it?
That's right.
It's actually affected a whole section of manufacturing is dying in Australia, or partly dying as a result of that.
That's right, yes.
That's a very common thing for natural resource countries. In fact, there's a name called natural resource curse, that this problem of large exporters of natural resources have their exchange rates increase and make it very difficult to either export or to compete against imports.
But the
boom in China, the boom in resources demand in China is a good thing for us.
Yes.
And the right thing to do is to take advantage of it, but not to spend all the money, to save a lot of it, because the boom won't last forever. The bit that's not forever is now. If we'd saved more of the money from 2003, 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, till things started to fall, we'd be in a much better position to manage things now. It was spending that money as it came in from China that drove up the real exchange rate and made us competitive. Joe's mentioned the Norwegians. They didn't do that. They taxed the resource income, put it in a fund, and now it's available to keep the economy growing.
Now, Ross, you say it's a good thing, but I might add that Hillary Clinton, who may, at some point in the future, possibly be the President of the United States, she says we're two-timing the United States with China. She's warned that more trade with China makes us dependent, undermines Australia's economic and political sovereignty.
Well, I don't mind Americans saying what they think about Australian policy. Hillary's welcome to her views, but it's a very dangerous view for Australia. The starting point of strategic thinking is to put yourself in the position of the other party. And what are Chinese going to think? The Chinese government, with Australia's ally, the United States, a possible future president, a past Secretary for State, saying, hey, think about withdrawing some of that trade. Now, the Chinese are relying on our energy, relying on our iron ore. If they start thinking, oh, Australians might listen to Hillary Clinton, then they will pull back. And this big 30% fall we've had since the beginning of January in iron ore and coal prices will become 50 and 60% in a minute.
Christine Wong, do you think that's a reasonable suggestion, that the Chinese would walk away from the trade if they feared that we might listen to Hillary Clinton?
Well, I think I haven't heard anything in China about the trade issue, but this is a very sensitive time where when the Australian government says Japan's our best friend in Asia and the United States is our closest ally, in a time when China is a rising power in the region and it's asserting itself in many respects, this could have a knock-on effect gradually on trade.
Can I say one of the things that I think Australia ought to be focusing on, though, is moving out of natural resources. I mean, you still will sell natural resources, but realizing that if you don't invest the proceeds into, as I said before, people, technology, and put yourself in the position of exporting services, education services, health services, lots of other services, tourism, that will be, in the long run, one of your competitive advantages.
Or agricultural products, which is
or
another one.
But I mean, it's actually a good news story. We didn't blow up the mining boom. You know, in the past, when Australia's had mining booms, we just managed to blow them up, right?
Sounds like Hillary Clinton might blow it up for us.
Well, I don't think so. I think it's all just political noise, that. I mean, what happened was that mining investment would normally maybe below 2% of GDP. We got to a peak of 10%. This has increased the capital stock enormously, forever, really. And I mean, basically, we are going to enjoy the benefits of much stronger export from the mining sector. Now, you know, the peak is behind us, and we are moving with some difficulty, I agree. I'm not sure I'm calling them dog days. They're difficult, perhaps. A transition. And those are the things: tourism, health services, wealth management, agribusiness and the like. But they are made very difficult by the persistence of our high dollar. And that, I think, you know, is a complicated story to figure out what's happening with the dollar. And it's actually got a lot to do with what's happening overseas, and overseas countries need to fiscally consolidate, and us being a safe haven for asset accumulation and the like. But there's no doubt that having such a high value to the dollar makes the process of economic transition without the costs much, much harder.
Okay, a quick change. We'll come back to the economy, but our next question has actually been chosen by votes from our Twitter audience. It comes from Jacomi Matthews.
Yes, Scott Morrison has just confirmed that Australia has handed back these Sri Lankan asylum seekers to the very government they were fleeing. An absolute appalling policy. Is this not in clear breach of our international legal obligations as far as refugees, asylum seekers are concerned? And is it not akin to essentially what happened in the Second World War and just prior to the Second World War with handing the Jews back over to the Nazis?
Ross Garnaut, we'll start you on that one. We'll bear in mind that what's happened this evening is that there's been a High Court injunction on the handing back of 153 Sri Lankan asylum seekers. We don't know where that court case will go, but there's been an injunction nonetheless. And word this evening too that the Sri Lankan police are suggesting that they will in fact jail for several years rigorously, as they put it. Some of the people have already been sent back.
Well, I don't know what the international law says, but the humanitarian dimension's pretty awful, and it's pretty bad if questions are being raised about whether we are obeying our own laws and international law, up to the High Court and others to form judgments on that. But a country like Australia needs to be in good standing by the international rules, because there's lots of issues on which we need them.
Christine, will Australia be judged by the way issues like this are treated by other countries? I mean,
I don't think China will care one way or another.
Carrying too much of its own baggage, is that what you're
That's
saying?
right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. What do you think personally, then?
I think it's appalling. I think this is a violation of international norms of behavior to send asylum seekers back to the countries where they're fleeing.
Joe Stiglitz?
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, there could be... The High Court has a very important case to judge on this tomorrow. We have no idea where they're going to go, but clearly there is a legal question mark over whether this was legal under international law or not.
But I think the point that's been made is that it's a moral issue as well. And to send them back to the people who are persecuting them. And, you know, their government has had a long record on this, so this is not the first, you know, indication. There are some cases where some countries where people are fleeing mainly for economic reasons. This is one case where there are good reasons for people to leave.
Judith Sloan?
Well, I think, you know, we have to wait and see what the High Court says tomorrow. I mean, I guess the broader point...
Do you have a personal opinion on how this has been handled?
Well, you know, the thing that's worried me all along about the debate about the asylum seeker issue is that it's rather diverted attention from the fact that we have a really, really successful immigration program. And in fact, our immigration program has been one of the contributors...
That's a broad question, though, specifically about a number of people who are on the verge of being sent back to Sri Lanka.
No, but it's Ross's point that sometimes these issues, which I think, you know, obviously create some terrible moral dilemmas and important reactions, can kind of actually end up having some very negative spillover effects to some other policy areas. But I think we still have to wait and see what the High Court says tomorrow.
OK, look, we're going to move back to economics. Sorry to those people who got their hands up. The next question is from Adrian Hearn.
Thank you. 2 weeks ago, Clive Palmer proposed an emissions trading scheme under which Australia would only fully participate or fully sign up to that scheme if our major trading partners also did the same and pursued the same course as us. So I'm interested to know from the panel if you think that China and our other major trading partners would seriously look at pursuing a similar path to Australia, taking similar climate action as us, and more generally, if you think Mr. Palmer's proposal strikes a good balance between economic competitiveness and leadership on climate action.
Let's start. Thank you. Let's start with Christine. What do you think the Chinese government intends to do? Is it possible there'll be a national version of an emissions trading scheme at some time in the near future?
Yes, I think China. I think Ross has done a lot of work on this actually, but the Chinese government is now pursuing a very aggressive program to curb emissions and to cut back on these climate change issues. Yeah. And
is that part of the large structural changes that are going on at the moment?
Because big reform program.
Obviously, we're going to see a slowing of Chinese growth, which will have an impact on emissions. But what about the possibility of a national emissions trading scheme, which is, in a way, the condition that Mr. Palmer has put on Australia having one, in his view?
The central government is on record with a very, very tough program to cut back on emissions. The question in China always is whether it will be implemented by local governments who want to protect jobs, protect industries, protect tax revenues, and so on. But the program is there on paper, and it's part of the 12th five-year plan, and it's part of the big reform program that the Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang government is promoting.
Now, Christine is absolutely right, and they've been talking about this for a number of years. They take climate change very seriously, partly because they've been forced to deal with the reality of environmental issues. Air pollution is a real problem, and although carbon is only one aspect of the overall environmental problem, the fact that air pollution is so bad has given a credibility to this issue of pollution.
And,
There are
water pollution and soil pollution, all of these
That's
things.
right. Really very central to the government policy. There is actually a talk even of imposing a carbon tax. And the other part of the question was, is Australia losing leadership? It seems to me that you had a leadership in trying to having a carbon tax. Putting a price in carbon is absolutely essential. There are different ways of doing it. But you've basically, what I see going on right now is a step backward.
Ross Garnaut, what do you think? It is a step backward in the sense that even if a Palmer-style emissions trading scheme was put in place, there'd be no price on carbon.
Yeah, well, I've had a couple of chats with Clive Palmer, a long one in front of you, Tony, about climate change. And
that's when he didn't believe in climate change 2 months ago.
No, and I think Australia's much better off now that he does, and that he wants an emissions trading scheme. We've got a very good emissions trading scheme in place now, so it'd be much easier to keep the current one than scrap it and build another one. But it's not just the way in which you reduce emissions. China, I'd go further than Joe. It's not that China may have a carbon tax. It will have a carbon tax and probably an emissions trading scheme as well. They've already got an emissions trading scheme working in 5 cities and 2 provinces, a couple 100 million people, and and they've got a myriad of regulatory interventions.
Exactly.
If you were running a coal power station like they do down in the Latrobe Valley in Victoria or the Hunter Valley, you'd be told to close it, or you would have been given a few months to get emissions down to a certain standard, or close it. And it's not just the emissions trading scheme that we should look at. About 2 years ago, two and a half years ago, the Obama administration in the United States was in the position that Australia's in now. It had wanted to introduce an emissions trading scheme, and it didn't have the support of the Congress. It went through the House of Representatives, but it was filibustered in the Senate. And then after the 2010 congressional elections, it wasn't going to happen. I had a long yarn to Obama's Minister for Energy, Secretary for Energy, Stephen Chu, who knows a bit about these things. Clinton appointed him as Secretary for Energy because he had a Nobel Prize in physics and knew all about climate change. And I said to Stephen Chu, doesn't the defeat of the emissions trading scheme mean that you're going to be battling to meet the president's commitment to reduce emissions by 17% by 2020? He said, look, don't worry, Ross. We wanted to reach our ambitious emissions reduction targets in a low-cost way that did a minimum damage to business and American households. But the Congress has stopped us doing that. We'll reach our target, but we'll do it in a way that does more damage to business and
by regulation.
By regulation.
And that's
what the United States is doing. In the last 2 years, the president's made 3 separate announcements that have, one by one, implemented all of the measures that in that long conversation Stephen Chu told me they were going to do.
Except they've had a bit of luck. And they've engaged in a dramatic exploration program, a fracking program, to exploit the shale gas. And as a result of that, the price of domestic gas in America, which has lower emissions than coal, has declined dramatically, and that's principally how America will reach its emissions target reduction. It's great that we could happen in Australia too.
Yeah, the problem with that view, Judith, is that proportionally we've had a much bigger expansion of gas reserves in the United States. In eastern Australia, our gas prices have increased enormously. The carbon tax will go, but gas prices will rise much more in the next year than they ever did when the carbon price was introduced.
But it was great in America, and that's how they got there.
Because in the United States, they discovered a lot more reserve and restricted exports. So prices fell. In Australia, we discovered
they haven't got the terminals.
In Australia, we discovered a lot more gas. encouraged export capacity, which I think is a good thing, but we increased prices by several times.
Briefly, because we're running out of time, are you saying there should be a strategic reserve kept in Australia?
No, I'm saying that prices are low in the United States because of differences in trade policy.
No, but you're saying that we shouldn't do the same thing as America and hold a certain percentage of the gas that we dig out of the ground, hold it in Australia for domestic use?
Tony, you'd never get an economist to agree with that.
No, I don't agree. I don't want restriction, but the absence of restriction is why we have high gas prices.
But I just do want to emphasize that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, regulations on coal will make a very big difference.
Which are very inefficient, Joe. They're very inefficient compared with the carbon price.
It would have been far better to have a carbon tax.
Don't slag off a direct action and say those regulations.
Judith, we better just actually hear what he has to say. Go ahead.
Now, what I'm saying, it would have been far better to have an emissions trading scheme or to have a carbon tax. They couldn't get it through because of resistance from the coal.
I'm actually not meaning to interrupt you here, except to expand on the point, and that is that isn't it the case that state by state they're having to figure out how to deal with these regulations, and many of the states are actually building their own emissions trading schemes because
that's right. So look, in both the East Coast and the West Coast, there are actually a lot of state action to create efficient systems for dealing with carbon. It's only a small fraction of the United States that still doesn't believe in global climate change. But we had to get it through Congress, and we're having problems, partly because we have a gerrymandered Congress.
Well, I'm afraid that is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Christine Wong, Joseph Stiglitz, Ross Garnaut and Judith Sloan. Thank you. Next week, thank you. Next week on Q&A, we will let the politicians back in with the former Immigration Minister, Philip Ruddock, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Tanya Plibersek, the Principal of the King's School in Sydney, Tim Hawkes, Cape York Indigenous Leader, Tanya Major, and the former host of the project, comedian Charlie Pickering. Until next week's Q&A, good night.